Freedom in Australia is dead. So we got the final report relating to the cash restriction bill. Came out late Friday.
Yes.
And boy, it's a doozy.
So I think it's a very disappointing outcome for Australia in terms of the report. There's quite a few things to have a chat about in today's show. One's about the report, one's about the context, and also about what happens when we go forward. So I mean, we thought that Labor would actually stand up for freedom, stand up for working people, but they have basically caved in, and I think it was quite disappointing.
Yes. And, there was always a sense, I think, along the journey that they were not clear in their own minds about what they were doing, right? And they do run scared on a lot of things, that has to be said. But this is a very disappointing outcome because it also begs the question as to why have the inquiry at all if basically you just go through the motions, you basically get evidence from all sorts of people, and then the final report is basically a watered-down version of that evidence, and a lot of things that we'll go into perhaps in a bit more detail were not spoken about, right? And yet what you're really saying is, well, whatever happens, they're just going to vote it in anyway.
Yes, well, the politicians have to be seen to be undertaking a serious process. They have to seem to be, going through some sort of deliberative, contemplation about this law. And yet, from what we can tell, is that contemplation, that hasn't happened. I mean, even though we saw in the first public hearing in December a lot of tough questions by Gallagher, who's no longer on the committee, and we saw some reasonably tough questions at the hearing that I appeared. I appeared on the 30th of January. Labor, in terms of what I've been told, basically had a position that they were going to support. And that basically, regardless of the evidence, they're just going to do what they're being told by whoever. So we don't know who gave the order. Was it Albanese? Was it Chalmers, the shadow treasurer, or whoever? So someone has said, no, Labor will press ahead with this, and that's why they have effectively said pass the bill subject to a couple of changes here and there.
Who do you think wrote this report?
So the report would have been written by the parliamentary staff. So the committee, so the Senate Economics Committee have its own staff, the Secretariat. So they're responsible for organising submissions, putting public hearings on, writing reports, and working with the committee to actually come up with the final report. So here's the thing. So I think that the chair would have guided the staff, and so Mark Fitt, who was the secretary, he's the secretary of the committee. That they would have had some guidance process. But the committee report was written by bureaucrats. But that doesn't mean that the politicians can't actually pull their pen out and say, hey, we want a substantial rewrite of this bill, or in terms of this report, or we don't like how you wrote this report, we're going to have a dissenting report or an alternative opinion. So politicians have enormous capacity to change language in a report, to actually dissent from the report, but Labor in particular didn't do that. And Centre Alliance actually didn't write a dissenting report as well. So it's interesting to know what Centre Alliance's view of this report is, given that this report's an abomination.
Right, so what you're saying is if they'd wanted to do something, they could have.
Absolutely.
Right, so the fact they didn't speaks volumes.
Agreed.
Yeah. So where does that take us, John?
The next step in this process is we need to wait for a response from the government. So the government now has to respond to this report. So of these, so there's eight recommendations. The first 7 say do something, and recommendation 8 says if you do all 7, then pass the bill. Now, how many? So we know that the government is going to do one of them, which is change the commencement date. So we know that. Of the others, we need to wait to see what Sukkar and Frydenberg and Morrison say, and depending on what they say, again, Labor, Albanese's office yesterday said that they haven't come to a final position. People on the phone are saying something very different to me. But now, if people do want to wish to, I think people should. I think people should do a couple of things. I think that people should absolutely call the coalition and Labor and say you betrayed us. you didn't actually do this properly. We don't accept this law. We don't accept your evidence. And if you vote for this, we're not going to vote for you at the next election. I think, unfortunately, it looks like this law, in one form or another, will become law. And I think this is a terrible signal that Australia has sent the world.
Well, it's a betrayal, isn't it? It's a betrayal of trust. It's a betrayal of personal freedom. And basically, it's a really eye-opening understanding of what really goes on behind the scenes in politics.
Absolutely.
Which is messy and not in our interests.
The report says, well, this issue of freedom and privacy has to be balanced against the black economy and the money laundering and the tax evasion aspect. And again, the evidence does not show that this cash payment limit at $10,000 is actually going to make one iota difference to these two issues, and the government can't produce any evidence. And again, Labor's own senator said there is no evidence for this. So on what basis do they proceed? It seems pretty corrupt to me.